Hey Shane,
Hi there, how are you doing?
good. I'm good. It might just be you and me.
It might, in which case it's going to be a short meeting. How are things in the new role?
Well, the new world are great. I have my branded jacket, so I'm
Ooh,
new pandemic onboarding. It's good. It's a little weird interviewing and joining a company completely remotely, which in
yeah,
the source world, there's a lot of open source companies who are like, of course, that's how we do it. But this is the first time I've been on either side of the full remote. But it's
right.
my laptop showed up. I've been going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, and it's all good. And OpenChain is a huge part of my job. So
Oh, cool. We like to hear that.
we are rolling out compliance and policies and all that, and it's been a good roadmap. But it's also been very helpful to kind of see, um, the things that when you're going from a green field,
Yeah,
and there's policies and there's program. I'm coming into a place where there already was an open source working group, there already was legal staff, but I'm their first director of open source. There's a lot of things where we look backward in OpenChain to say, of course, here's what we did. And you
yeah,
look, of course we did this. But when you're rolling it out the first time and you have that green field, you're like, oh well, we don't have a letter that says X. Where's
right.
our announcement letter to the company about there's a policy coming? So there's some. I've been keeping a OpenChain adoption diary, but we'll get some time to pass on and turn into either some. I'm going to try to back them up, but
Yeah, yeah,
as well. But, I think one of the things that I'm seeing kind of coming from the other side, and we all know this, is more of the rollout collateral. Like,
right.
um, here's the email that you send to the engineering leads. Here's the email that you send to everybody in the company that
Mm,
announces your new policy. Kind of more of like it's one thing to have the policy, but then what's the marketing around the policy? How do you communicate? The thing that I've been working on right here is, okay, we had a one pager. We're now going to go to a four pager, but
right.
the scenes, it's a 200 pager.
Yes,
How do you kind of explain to people, hey, we're going to send out the open source policy, but there's more. If you have a thing about LGPL linking, I'm not going to send that in the email that goes to everybody's inbox, but we have a,
right.
and that is in the spec, but it's kind of like um, for the people who are reading ahead a little bit, it's like, hey, I have questions about linking. I have questions about this. I don't see it in the policy. What's wrong? That we want to get ahead of that and kind of be ready.
No, that's going to be super useful. I remember talking with some of the team from Toyota in the early days, and even when it came to notifying people about the policy, uh, they were like, so we're thinking of setting up an online platform that everyone will have to go into and register that they know there's a policy. It's like, you could just email
Yeah.
them.
What's nice is we actually have a system at work where everybody logs in every day. They have a portal, and it's just, you open your browser, you can't even get around it. You open it up and it says the news of the day, the blog of the day, the notices of the day. And anytime we need to send out an actual, you know, I need you to click OK, it's part of, you read it, and it's like the I accept button at the bottom of a download. You just go, yep, I see it. And it makes it real easy to get compliance for these types of things. Hey, 85% of people opened it and they all said yes, whether they absorbed it or not, we'll see.
That's actually awesome. A landing portal for the day is such an elegant solution.
Yeah, it's plus and minus. When I'm trying to open my fourth tab to like go to some like GitHub site or something like that, and I gotta wait for the thing to pop open, I'm kind of like, but it is good when you're the other side of sending out a policy. It's kind of nice to know that there's a communication
Yeah. Mark and Emoji-san just joined. And just so you guys can catch up, we were talking about how the world has changed with remote work. And starting with a new company remotely is fascinating. Actually, my sister just did exactly the same experience. She joined the British government in the forensic accounting area of tax. And initially I was like, accounting, ha, no one will ever talk to you again. But then
channel.
forensic accounting sounds so cool.
That's it. The next CSI
I
forensic
know. But again, it was the same deal. It was like remote everything, and a laptop turned up, and then it's just online classes and so on. Yeah. So if I remember correctly, your company is in finance, right?
It's a fintech company, so they do
Yeah.
trading. They have parts that are very, highly regulated. So
Yeah.
it's not a surprise to have a policy come in that says you must do this. But then we also have we have a small, a division of us that's an esports league. So there's
Oh,
actually it's kind of everything from fintech trading to flood insurance and an esports league. So it's kind of interesting. Crosses all the distribution channels.
it sounds similar in some ways to what we're beginning to see with the Chinese conglomerates like Tencent, where the finger's in every pie.
Yeah, yeah. It makes it interesting.
So I think you're definitely embarking on something that many people are very interested in, Jeff. And I think sometimes there's a big jump from spec from starting and building out. I'm saying the obvious, right? A compliance program and where the spec is, and I think we have to manage the expectations around that because you can't just take the spec and say I'm going to build my program. I think you could. There's a way of doing it, but you got to do it with a certain kind of understanding of almost like you've done it before.
Yeah.
I mean, the OpenChain project has many, like Tencent, has many things going on, and I think there are a number of different activities that could be really potentially benefiting from this. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think the spec. One of the things that I really try to emphasize to everybody, and it's not that it's not clear here, but it's worth is that it's not a how to doc. It's the opposite. It's a what and why versus a how and when.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I really that's always a confusion for a lot of people. I get it, why that would be, but it's really important to understand. And all of a sudden, it becomes this foreign thing once you explain that, right? It's like, why is it? Why is it even relevant? It's not helping me get my day-to-day stuff done. I think there has to be a little bit. OpenChain has to make a little bit more substance to have more best practices. I guess you're really looking for best practices.
So what I'm looking, what's nice about OpenChain for me is I'm coming in as the first director of open source for a company, and with the goal of kind of the three legs. I want you to make policy, I want you to help with compliance, and I want to help with community. So each of those um, and what I like about OpenChain is I can kind of look at this and almost work backward for my year. Say at the end of the year, what I build, it would be good for me to have this, and this. It doesn't have to be a roadmap, but it sure makes it, especially if I have a choice of do this thing or this thing. This thing helps me get more on my OpenChain compliance. This doesn't. I'm probably going to pick the thing that gets me to the OpenChain compliance, because there's so many things we can do.
Well, there are the high level things, right, that OpenChain has. Like it says, right, I look at it as 5 or 6 core things, right? You have to have a policy, right? One, you have the roles and responsibilities. And you have to have a process for constructing a bill of materials for open source, right? And then you have to have this is the fourth one is a systematic way of going through the bill of materials. And finally, producing the artifacts. That's I think the spec in a nutshell. And then the fifth section is community engagement, which is a little on the light side. It doesn't, and we're going to, as we move forward, we're going to talk about that. I think that the community engagement part could be this optional piece that we talked about, Shane, like right there with security. I think it's a great candidate for that because it's not everybody's going to have that, but everything else in the spec we expect people to have, right? So anyway, we can go into that, but I think there's got to be more effort to help people see those big rocks, right? And that when you design your program, if you do that and you moved whatever you do, as long as you eventually get to those 5 core things, you're going to be in good shape for compliance or conforming. So, but it's not, how can I say it? It's not a tool to help you build their program. It is a guide to help you that when you're done, you'll be able to say, I'm complete. I have what they consider to be complete, right?
Internally, I use it like building code. You can build a mansion, you can build a shack, you can build whatever you want to make. But as long as it, hits these things, check, you are open.
Exactly. The analogy in the beginning I used to say is, I'm looking for my realtor. I want a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with a backyard.
Yeah.
Right? There's lots of houses that fit that, right? And that's like, there's different ways of doing things in compliance. So that's an analogy I used to use in the beginning, very now, similar to what you're saying. And so that's what we're saying, right? 3-bedroom, 2-bath, backyard, and 2-car garage. Any house that meets those requirements, those are my minimum, then I want to look at the house, right? So I think that, yeah. So I do understand you have a huge foundation for this, but I also get it. You have to move an organization, and it's a lot of getting them to understand the why we do this in the first place. Why are you making me spend time on this? But
and your point about the community engagement, the phrase that keeps coming out of when I talk to people internally is, we have to do this, we have to do this, we have to do this. And on this side, on the community engagement, if we never produce an open source platform, we're still successful because we have to do this, 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 and this. It'd be nice. It gives us the freedom in order to release something as open source or make a platform or whatnot.
mm-hmm.
You don't have to. You can be, you may not be a great citizen if you do that, but you are still respecting open source. You're still, fulfilling your.
Yeah. To the point also, to your point, the first 4 sections of the spec are table stakes. That's what you have to do to use open source. There's no getting around that. There's just no getting around it. And then you could talk about security. I mean, yes, of course, security is important, but if you're using open source and you're worried about security on open source, well, you can't use that open source even in the first place and give you that opportunity to have security problems, right? So I see that also, like so that's why I think the community engagement, you can't really do community engagement until you are already doing what's absolutely necessary. So yeah, it's consistent, I think, for where we're going.
And it's good to have it's really nice to have here we are looking at one company, looking at the spec and looking at the things that we need to put in. And some things that have been kind of eye-opening for me is kind of like there's these gates between the commercial world and the open source world. And as I look toward where the spec goes and where we go with our supporting documentation, breaking down the classic commercial world, the classic open source world. And then just a lot around containers. Everybody's Kubernetes, everybody's Docker, everybody's this. And when your policy comes out and is talking about GPL and BSD and all that, there's this, if you're in the embedded world with Linux, if you're in the container world, the kind of saying, oh, copyleft, we don't want to do it here, but we want to do it here, gets really confusing for folks. And anything we can do to kind of help people understand when does copyleft come into effect and where is that line? Tooling helps, but also I think that's.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just had a conversation with someone else in my organization about, we've always, for the last 10 years, have separate IP policies. When I say that, I mean, how people have whitelist and blacklist on licenses? We don't do it for the company. We do it per product line, right? And whether a container is relevant or not, I think that's a very important granularity to achieve. And I don't think a lot of people do that. They all want to create this universal office with a universal policy, one size fits all. And I've come to this conclusion that, well, especially in the nature of our company, right? We have a commercial OS, we have a commercial grade Linux, and they're different, right? And there's times, in one runtime you can have GPL, and the other runtime it doesn't work. So, yeah. But containers is interesting to me. I even though I'm seeing it so much now that to me it's like a Linux runtime, except everybody seems to be. The only problem is that no one knows what's inside it, right? Which is the scariest part. But anyway, we can digress on that. By the way, Jeff, I know we're in the same neighborhood. It's been a long time, but I'm more than happy to sit down and just talk shop if you want. Don't hesitate. I mean, you have a history and a foundation. In fact, one of the very first tools we ever used was Palamita back in 2005.
Exactly.
So we have a long history there.
Good to see that.
Speaking of the spec in general, Mark, I think one of the interesting things has been how many companies are appearing in our ecosystem now with the ISO standard. And so far, I haven't had any negative feedback regarding understandability and onboarding and so on. So as we get new companies like Seagate this morning, I was on a conference with them, as we see defense companies like Lockheed Martin appearing around our ecosystem, everyone seems to be doing all right. And our messaging around submitting issues for the spec appears to have gone down well. You know, no one seems to be thinking, oh, you're going to pull the rug from under us and update the ISO standard this year. No, no one's thinking that. So the process you outlined, Mark, the way you've done it seems to have worked pretty good. I just wanted to check, has anyone contacted you directly? Because I know one of our channels is you can anonymously contact Mark. I just wanted to see if people have touched base or we're already seeing everything.
So over the course of the, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, I've only had twice someone reach out to me anonymously. It doesn't, not much comes that pathway. It's just a pathway we want to, I think it was more important in the beginning. I think this whole compliance was, there was more secrecy around it. I felt it was, you know, their secret sauce or somehow, you know. But I think it's important to have that, because some people, you know, they feel it's sometimes it's important, but
Yeah.
It's an opportunity. That's an interesting thing. So there's several different ways for feedback to come in. I would just have that as an option, but it's not often used.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And when it comes to next stuff, it's actually what Jeff mentioned earlier. People are asking just for more reference material, more flowcharts, checklists to guide them on implementation.
So again, I want to emphasize that. I think I totally get that. It's probably where more people want to spend time. But there's that confusion about the spec. And I don't think anybody here is confused about that. But I mean, people are expecting to pick up the spec and it's going to help how to get them to where they want to go. And it's going to be very disappointing if that's the view.
And especially, I mean, now that it's an ISO standard, they might download it expecting something like OpenXML, you know, 7,000 pages of explicit documentation.
Right.
And they get 7 pages.
The analogy to bring possibly here too is like ISO 9001, 2015, right? That's a quality spec. And it cuts across a broad range of companies, and quality is even more broader than open source compliance. Right. Yet it has some high level pillars about what you need to do to have a quality program or people to trust your quality. And there's no how-to there, right, at all, right? And we have to, I think, draw that analogy whenever we can, and then say, you know, you get to build your quality program and you just get to articulate it. You can trust us because you match up to certain things on the spec. And again, we're talking about the same thing, just I think it's a challenge we have that we have to constantly work at.
Right. And one thing that probably is really good to know is that the idea of extensions to the spec, and not necessarily touching the ISO standard, but explaining how do you implement this in security, or what does it mean in security? What do you do in export control? That seems to be on people's radar because they're beginning to leverage OpenChain into these areas, and there's a gap between where we end and where the requirements end.
So I think the thing to maybe highlight, I know people are nervous about this idea that the spec could shift a little bit on them, but as you pointed out, it's not going to shift in the next 12 months, is to tell them the only thing that might pop up is a new area that we are, you know, and I think that's where we'll probably spend the energy, is actually say, let's talk about security. What are let's talk about what that is and start that engagement, and get the basic requirements out, and that's not going to be disruptive to people because no one's done it. Right. Let me ask this question. I get the security part. I get export. I mean, we've had issues around, you know, we had to deal with export, but I don't know how many people are talking about it. It's interesting. I think more people should be, but very few are.
For me, it's been essentially Wind River's talked about it. I've noticed that people from Toshiba, people from Hitachi have been nodding their heads, but it's a small subset of the companies. But you know, honestly, I think if we can explain, and you know, I might be wrong, but I think in the early days here, what people could expect this year is problem statements and potential solution descriptions. You know, how do you do OpenChain in that area? And I'm pretty sure that if we do explain it, people will forward it to the relevant department for export control. I suspect that where we're held back is that mostly it's open source program offices, and they have nothing to do with the export control section.
Hmm. So that's interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So go ahead, Jeff. You have a comment?
By joining a financial company. Previously, when I've looked at export control, eyes of encryption and munitions and
Yeah.
kind of the classic whatnot. I think in the fintech world, the idea of there's additional lists of countries you can't do business with that are not part of the traditional export control munitions issue, encryption issue, but more about your list of countries you can't do financial dealings with or work with. Probably a very similar list, if not the same list, but from a different view. And this might be something that we have to pay more attention around. If we're not allowed to work with these countries, does that involve GitHub requests? Does that involve
that's a good point.
Services and things like that? So looking at export control, not just being around encryption, but also around, every country has a list of countries that they're not allowed to do business with.
Right. So that was another interesting experience we've had. I've worked with countries where someone in France who had their own. And by the way, export is slightly defined differently. I've dealt with, believe it or not, people in Hong Kong, and one time a company from Russia. Russia has its own issues. Everybody wants to, a lot of it does center around cryptography. I'm not saying it all does, but it seems to be the driver for a lot. The other thing is interesting. You might talk about these embargoed countries, but actually, in the US, there's this notion that if you just want to export your software, and you're dealing with, maybe China's not embargoed, but you can't, you have to have an export license if you're going to go to the military,
Mhm.
right? So I think you're right. We need to be mindful that it's cross jurisdiction. It's not just, and what are the basics? And I do think there's a basic principle there. Um, so cryptography is one, right? And here's the big challenge I found. Everybody has this. Everybody grabs tons of open source, right? How many people, you ask the engineer, well, tell me about the cryptography. That's what the export person is going to ask you. And so we had to write a scripts to go and detect this stuff because, and it's, again, back to trust in open source. I'm grabbing all this open source. I'm going to deliver it to you. I'm in the supply chain. I'm going to give it to someone else. Tell me about cryptography, that stuff that you have in your product, which happens to have tons of open source. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a lot about having insight, and do you have a disciplined process to get insights into that? I think a lot of companies are really, I'm surprised how many aren't. And I have to say, one of the reasons why we got real religion around export was when we were acquired by Intel. And Intel was concerned, and rightly so, because if we messed up, then the whole company loses the right to export. So, but at the same time, I can't talk about it. I don't know. I know it's important. I know a lot of people are probably not doing it right. And I do think it's important for us to create trust around open source, right? That's our number one mission.
It's a fascinating thing that you mentioned, Jeff. I mean, what happens if you in the US give write access to the Iranian National Guard to your repository? Or if you're in Iran and you give write access to the NSA open source team?
I can think there's been one time, and I've looked at, I can't tell you how many open source reviews I've looked at, thousands, probably thousands. I would say there's probably only one time in that whole time that there was an explicit country where I was like, nope, that's on a list. This JavaScript component cannot be put there. But it was never in scope to look and see like email accounts who had access to GitHub, who was contributing and whatnot. I think that's going to be that's a bigger issue than I think our spec can handle. But it is a question. If you are in a situation like where Mark is, you're at a large public or highly regulated company.
Yeah.
How do you even track that without I don't know, maybe that's a feature for GitHub.
No, it's a really interesting point. And I mean, I guess right now, because everything is public, many people are just hoping that no one notices. Certainly, I mean, when it comes to something like the OpenChain project, we don't have to care about this stuff, but even our small volume project, 4,000 subscribers on our main mailing list and so on, and the GitHub 120 people or something, and I have no way to check the provenance of their locations. I don't need to, but imagine having 10,000 people contributing to your GitHub and no check on provenance. Yeah.
So go ahead, Jeff. What?
This is like 3.0 of the spec.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe the best way, let's talk about the approach. We don't want to boil the ocean or boil too many of these things simultaneously. I don't think export is as much on the radar for a lot of people. I think we should have a placeholder for it and say, we're willing, please come to us. Well, let's have a breakout discussion less frequently than say security, but probably the best thing to do is start the security discussion and also talk about the community engagement component module, and let them go and let's just see how they evolve. I think what will happen with community engagement, again, I'd like to see that as an add-on to the spec as opposed to in the core spec. But the good news is I don't think the spec has a lot on it right now. So like anything we do extra, if you want that extra badge, I think of it as a badge. Like, okay, so we're talking about, and let's sync on this a little. Are we talking about you get OpenChain conforming? That means you can trust that I'm going to give you. I handle my open source licensing. I'm good on that. Now I also have this additional certification on security or community engagement. That would be an extra that you can go. It's optional, right?
Oh, I just put in the chat, like you could be ISO 5320 or 5230. I can't remember. And plus OpenChain Security 1.1, the add-on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
So another badge.
Right. Yeah, I only use that because that's kind of the lingo that sometimes Linux Foundation uses, right? Yeah, so you have that additional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That could be a really simple mental model to allow people to be innovative here. Not worrying too much about overloading the spec, but build a new chunk.
Right.
Be a +1.
I do. I mean, there's that bullseye approach. Like we started with licensing because it's simple and it's required and it's tough. The always on world has kind of made it so that security is part, the next ring around it. And one of the biggest issues with the open source world is like, when are you going to fix it? How are you going to fix it? And we probably can't put that in as the spec, but it is, there's the spec serves as a forcing function. So how do I, am I OpenChain conformant security if I never update? Or how do you handle dead projects and things like that? So there's kind of the obligations on you to push fixes, and then there's the obligations on you to maybe become a farmer and take over the care and feeding of something that has become orphaned or whatnot.
Yeah. And I think the best place to start possibly is just what is a good practice or discipline you like them to have, and just have them validate that they have that principle. Or so, like, for example, we regularly check every quarter for vulnerabilities. I don't know, that's so primitive, but and it's just the fact that that they're just checking, and then they have second requirement, you have a mechanism for communicating to your customer base when you find something. Some very simple things. Keep it simple in the beginning and let it mature over time. And I think we could have something very basic, because to your point, not a lot of people do. I mean, it's not a lot of formality here. We have to listen to all the best practices and then figure out what's kind of minimal, good, to give some comfort to others. So Jeff, I mean, how much does security impact what you do?
I'm there primarily for open source, like compliance,
Mm-hmm.
licensing, and both consume and produce. That is the heart of what I was brought in for. But security is just like it's hard to not think about security. So it's my job is to make the bill of materials. Licensing will fall out of that, and then security falls out of that as well. Primarily, it was the licensing world, but security, I guess, long story short, it's hard to say security is not important.
Yeah, it's interesting that you highlighted that. The bill of materials is something that even security people need done, right? And even export people need done. So that's why the spec and the bill of materials is so core to the spec. It's core to license compliance, it's core to security, it's core to export. An area we don't talk about much because it's more of a niche, but functional safe software too. It's growing, especially with autonomous driving vehicles, all or the medical device industry. But I don't want, that's something I'd like to see us go. I know Linux Foundation does a fair amount with Linux and functional safety, but we'll have to wait on that one.
And I do think, we'll see, maybe there's certain subsections, like you said, functional safety, um, medical devices, um, fintech, and the regulations inside of financial services for like data arrest, and PII, and things like that. So I wonder if we'll see certain subsections appear. If you're in this industry, you may need to have these additional.
Right. So for example, I look at, functional safety is very more analogous to like security. But in the medical device world, they care a lot about it. In the aerospace defense, they do. They may not care as much about it in fintech, although I'm not sure. I'm not saying that's true. I'm not. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think understanding those hot zones for the different options is going to be very helpful for us. But at the end of the day, we're back to that same principle that everybody's got to know about. Everybody's got to be compliant with open source because they live and die by it. There's no getting around that today. So in your organization, Jeff, security, is it handled by someone else?
Yeah, we have CISOs. And developer, there's the developers who manage, this kind of day-to-day security, and then there's corporate security, which is managed by CISO.
I'm talking about security vulnerability of open source.
That's a developer engineering oriented task there. You're going to see out of the use of repository managers and scanning.
And where do you sit within your organization?
I'm part of a shared services team. So we have shared services like a security shared services, engineering, kind of ops, and then now open source. And the idea is, you have one guy and his helpers to serve all the needs of people, whether it's compliance questions, security questions, training questions.
Okay, so I have another topic I wanted to talk about logistically, how we move forward with, I know you're changing schedules, Shane?
Yes, I'll put that up on the screen right now with the general schedule. So just some background for people who aren't aware, we had a request come in from BMW, but they're not the only party which wanted it. It's weird, I can't actually do what I want. Why isn't preview not? Oh, here. Oh, I'm so sorry, give me a second. Oh, there we go. That should be showing the adjusted meeting schedule right now. This came in from BMW, but it was echoed by other companies in Asia and Europe, that basically they weren't happy that they were only able to come to half the meetings. So they want to move to a global schedule that will make it uncomfortable occasionally in the US and in Asia, but not untenable, because previously we had a 3 a.m. In Asia, and we had a 1 a.m. in Europe on calls. So that's the suggested new meeting schedule for discussion. Over to you, Mark.
So the meeting itself, there's two sets of meetings you have right now, right?
Right.
We have the first and third of the month, and that seems to turn into webinars.
Those are webinars, and then these meetings, second Monday and fourth Monday, are global work team meetings where everybody can get together. And
now, when you what are all the different global teams? Like how many and what are they? I guess
right now we have education, we have tooling, we have automotive, we have conformance, we have spec, we have onboarding, and curriculum, which is adjacent to education, but a little bit different. Education is focused on an online course. Curriculum is traditionally focused on our GitHub repository. So we've got a raft of different people who could turn up at each of the global meetings.
Okay. How are we gonna, I guess I'm trying to figure out so that when the spec, I can organize, but I have to share time. It's not clear to me how I will, what I should expect and how much time to allocate per meeting.
At the moment, because the spec is so central, we found that almost everything hangs off the spec. So, I mean, you're still the central part of the project. So even if people want to drop in and talk education, they probably want to hear where we're at with the spec. But in practical terms, like editing, I expect that people will be primarily focused at a dedicated spec meeting. So by way of example, I'm proposing that every quarter we have an OpenChain mini summit, and that opens with at least a dedicated hour of sit down at the spec, talking about building the extensions, editing the extensions, and so on. So in that mental model, and this is only a suggestion, we'd have 4 dedicated inflection points for people to edit out the spec collaboratively, plus the meetings, the global meetings throughout the year to solicit feedback or make specific requests or just share updates. But it also depends on what you want to do.
Okay. I guess every meeting I like to try to think about an agenda, and I guess should we say that so much time is going to be like for other groups, and then
Sure.
so much time for spec?
We can definitely make it structured like that.
Okay. Okay.
So if, I mean, hypothetically, do you want to have, say, 20 minutes locked down for spec, or
Sure.
more or less? Okay.
Well, let's just say we'll commit 20 minutes to spec.
All right.
And maybe spec goes longer because there's nothing else. But that would be helpful to understand, because it's not clear to me how else, who else will be there, and you know, how time will be allocated.
Right. Understood. Well, this month was largely about making people aware that we're doing the schedule change and making people aware of exactly where we're at. So next month is probably when we begin work. So I'll make sure when I announce the new schedule to also solidify what we're doing. You know, 20 minutes to spec, 5 minutes, let's say, to other updates, and then blank space of 10 or 20 minutes for any other business to actually dive into something like, let's look at this checklist and kick the tires on it.
Okay.
All right. That sounds like a plan.
Yeah. And by the way, let's talk about the main agenda during the Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. So I'm also there are multiple ways feedback can come, and I have to start reviving those, right? There's obviously this meeting, there's the mailing list, there's the GitHub issues list, there's anonymous requests, and there's going to be mini summits. There's lots of inputs into this process. I guess I want to make sure that somehow there's a schedule too. Like these are, I guess, how am I going to say it? These meetings are not the only time spec discussions will happen.
Right.
And it's possible for me to hold a special meeting where I go visit. Well, it's going to be easier to visit the North American meeting, but maybe I go visit the Korean meeting or whatever. I can show up once in a while to just have kind of like an open office, give them opportunity to talk. Yeah, so that's another thought. And the other thing is, based on the schedule, I have to think about how it fits into my schedule. I might not always be at one of these meetings.
Right, right. And I think that you're right. Let's work with the assumption that not everyone can make every meeting out of the chairs, right? So we can't expect you to be at 10 p.m. meetings all the time. And that's fine. So I guess what you're suggesting is we somehow frame the whole year, what we're doing in these meetings, but also general schedule. And that's begun organically in areas like education, where they have a target delivery date of the member summit for the first online education by OpenChain. And maybe we can do the same thing, mapping out extension editing.
I think to that point, I want to create think of it as a single page that describes, here's how you provide input into the spec. Here's 5 different ways. Here's links to the ones that are online. Here's the upcoming meeting where you can come and you can voice your input.
Right.
And it's almost like, it's kind of there's multiple ways, but also this live opportunity it resides here on this schedule, but it can move to someone's, locale if it helps join in on another meeting that they have, working group or something. That's just a thought again, but I think there should be a page where people can go and understand where's the tour. It's on tour, right? Where's the current event happening, you
Okay.
know?
No, I'll take it as an action item and I'll work on it this week to try to create our scheduling. And I'll do it in collaboration with you to make
Mhm.
sure that we lock down
Yeah.
provisional dates that make sense.
When is the mini conferences? Do you have that?
Okay, so I plan to do the mini conferences adjacent to the member summit, which I'm just pulling up when this happens. The member summit is in March, I believe. Yeah, 9th of March is the member meeting. And I would see us having a mini summit perhaps on like the 10th of March, the day after. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll share my screen to show you where I'm at.
I assume most everything's going to be virtual this year.
Virtual, everything's virtual. In fact, I predict that for OpenChain, we'll stay virtual until 2022, probably.
Okay.
I mean, the vaccines might work, but
there's an intention to go back to some
yeah,
in-person meeting. I don't know. We don't know how the world will change, but I don't know whether the Linux Foundation, obviously they're going to get really good at doing this virtual stuff. How much will return back to the conferences? I kind of enjoyed those things. There was opportunities to meet up and stuff.
you know, I think that we can probably rely on at least 4 events that will be perfect for OpenChain physical. The member meeting in Q1, Linux Foundation North America's event, which this year is happening in August, but often happens sometime around Q2. So Open Source Summit North America, then Open Source Summit Europe, which happens in September, and finally Open Source Summit Japan / Open Compliance Summit. So I think those 4 events are where I'd like to hang mini summits, and I also see those 4 events as almost inevitably returning to physical meetings when feasible.
Mm-hmm.
And the cadence isn't perfect because of this year, it's kind of crunched, like August is North America, September is Europe, but it's pretty close to every quarter a major mini summit or event.
Looks like you're being asked to share the link.
Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm gonna put that link in right now. Here you go. Thanks, Mark. Good flag. Yeah, sorry if I missed something in the chat. I'm a bit of a space cadet at times. Someone needs to yell at me. I don't always see the notification. But yeah, this is the event page, and it's pretty accurate. So the dates so on are normally fixed. And even if we convert to physical meetings later in the year, you can expect pretty much the same dates. All right, I think that basically covers it. I mean, it's my job now to start making, proposing and then implementing the structure of our global calls and to start making our global schedule map. And then Mark, for instance, you can hang the milestones you want onto the schedule map, and we can maybe aim to communicate that before our next global meeting.
Sure.
Second Monday in February, that people will know what the year is.
And Shane, question for you. Is the mini summit published? Is that information published someplace yet?
So our mini summit's not yet. So I'll aim to have that published as we do this calendar. My plan is to hold the mini summits with no registration on Zoom. So it's at the same time as the LF events, but won't have any gateways. And that's purposeful because a bunch of companies in OpenChain are not LF members. They're curious, they're getting closer to our ecosystem, and I want to draw them in.
You said that was that March 8th?
Yeah, so we have, I'm just gonna pull up right now the dates. So March 9 is when they're having the LF event for Member Summit. I see us probably March 10th, the day after. Because that's the day Linux Foundation normally would put mini summits. And I see that the same for every other event. So when we come to Open Source Summit North America, it's August 3rd to 6th. So I see us provisionally August 7th. Open Source Summit Europe, September 28th to October 1st. So I see us at October 2nd. as long as that's not a weekend. And so on and so forth. So the next one will be Open Source Summit Japan, probably late November, and would be one day after.
Awesome, thanks. And just another quick little note, the community page or whatnot still has the holiday message on it.
Oh, crap. I'm gonna go and fix that right now. Thanks, Jeff. Good catch.
I want to stretch out the holiday as well.
Yeah, we should just keep that. Be like, until the world is fixed, we're on vacation. That's tempting. That's really tempting.
Send an email.
Thanks for catching that. It's now disabled and updated, so no more holidays. Back to work, guys. All right. I think that is everything today, unless there's any other business. Nope. This was a really useful discussion. Thank you very much. And I have a clear set of action items. You'll see it happening this week.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shane.
All right, everyone. Take care. Have a lovely day. Be well.